We've got loads to talk about today, but just quickly, I know you've seen me and maybe heard from me on these calls before, but for folks who have not had the pleasure of working with more closely, I'm Kim Weed, and I'm in the Department of English and Comparative Literature at the University of North Carolina. But my work focuses, and my teaching focus in health humanities. So folks joining from UNC today are in a health humanities course and disability studies. So we're going to talk about some of these ideas, especially about how disability is conceptualized and the relationships between bodies, spaces, representation. So loads for us to get into today. I will just say that if at any point you have a question or you want to add a comment, you can use the raise hand feature or drop something in the chat. I may have to ask Jem or Benjamin or Antina to just kind of keep an eye on the chat in case I totally overlook something. You can give me, wave me down before I blow through something. And as a reminder for our, time together in this virtual space, we only have, a short bit of time together, but that doesn't mean that you can't take breaks and step away if you need to step away. But I hope that we can learn from each other and dive into it. So, like I said, today we have a lot of different topics, but I want to begin with this idea of fit or misfit because of, I think, the way that it situates the body and experiences of the body in both place and time. So we'll engage with that a little bit before I ask you with your discussion groups to share a little bit about your bridging activity. And then we'll look at some examples of built environments that may be familiar to some of us on this call and how they are both material and discursive. And I'll be sure to explain what I mean by that. And then we'll conclude by thinking about what representation has to do with all of this. And I have a poem about a built environment and a social environment that I think will help to make that transition for us. Okay, so I want to start, like I said, with this idea of fit or misfit. And in the Rosemary Garland Thompson article, that was one of the core readings for today, Garland Thompson sort of presents or posits this idea, right? This critical concept, as she calls it, of the misfit. And positions it as a kind of tool, right? A critical tool of analysis that, as she writes, allows us to think through the lived experience of disability as situated in place and time. So, part of what Garland Thompson is up to here is making an intervention into how folks have studied and conceptualized disability. And we'll get to a few of those in a bit. So, caveat here is I have a tendency, mostly as a literary studies person, to really drill down into the text. And my students know I have a habit of pulling these long passages because I can't help myself. But I'm going to use them as kind of anchors to talk through some of these ideas. And that's why I've included some highlighted text just to focus our attention. But I'll read them in their entirety. So thinking of, again, the misfit as a kind of critical concept or a tool for our thinking, Garland Thompson kind of explains a little bit more about what she means by this and what's at stake. So fitting and misfitting denote an encounter in which two things come together, either in harmony or disjunction. When the shape and substance of these two things correspond in their union, they fit. A misfit, conversely, describes an incongruent relationship between two things, a square peg and a round hole. The problem with the misfit, then, inheres not in either of the two things, but rather in their juxtaposition, the awkward attempt to fit them together. When the spatial and temporal context shifts, so does the fit. And when the meaning and with it, meanings and consequences. Misfit emphasizes context over essence, relation over isolation, mediation over origination. So, what I see this concept and this way of thinking about fit and misfit doing differently than some other disability studies work prior to this article is thinking of disability not as something of the only of the body or only produced in built environment, but really acknowledging the ways that those things, those two things, the body and place, and then I guess a third thing, time, interact to create different kinds of embodied experiences and different meanings of space, time, of disability. So, like I said, this is a bit of a departure from some disability studies work. And folks who have taken any classes or really done any kind of reading in disability studies, even I think something we read early, I want to say even for Gemma's session. If you're talking about disability studies, you will almost always get a distinction between the medical model and the social model. The medical model meaning a way of defining or conceptualizing disability through a biomedical framework, right? So prioritizing those ways of knowing would suggest that disability is an individual, I'm going to use big scare quotes here, problem, right, of the body. And it is something that often is considered as, a deficit, a lack, a defect that requires some kind of medical intervention to normalize the body or bring it closer in alignment with our sort of definitions of normalcy. And what the social model did is kind of come in or folks who conceptualize disability in the social model really flipped this on its head, right? To say not that disability is of the body, but actually it's produced by social environments, right? So a social environment might be, a physical space, it might be cultural attitudes or policies or sort of social structures that create disability by essentially not being built for, designed for folks with disability. So it shifts our focus, right, to the external environment. It's no longer a kind of individualized thing. And I could spend an entire semester talking about what that makes possible and what that leaves behind, but feel free to ask questions. Misfit, like we were just discussing, puts some of those things in relationship, right? It attends to the interaction between both of these sort of ways of thinking about disability. So Garland Thompson brings up, I think, what does she call it? The sort of like iconic or, oh, of course, I'm not going to find the passage as soon as I wanted to reference it. But anyway, she brings up this example that illustrates often the difference between social model and medical model. So I want us to, oh yeah, she calls this the iconic disability access scene. So here we have a photograph of someone using a wheelchair approaching a flight of stairs and another person, descending down the stairs. So if we were to sort of put on a filter, right, a sort of medical model filter, how might we describe what's happening in this photo? And you can raise your hand or unmute yourself just to chime in here. Yeah, the medical model is really going to focus on that the disabled person's physical body, right? And might often frames it as again a negative thing or a deficit in some way. So yeah, this idea of being wheelchair bound suggests that this is a perhaps undesirable state. So then what do we do about it, right? There's a problem here. There's a physical body that cannot, through this model, right, navigate the stairs. So the intervention is what in a medical model? What would we attempt to do, again, with that sort of filter on to mitigate this misfit? Well, we might reach for a cure in some way, right? How can we fix, again, big scare quotes, this body? How can we bring the body more in alignment with the built environment, the social environment, right? Now we flip that with sort of a social model perspective. And now we're not as focused on the individual body, right? It's about the stairs, right? We're acknowledging through a social model, we can acknowledge and notice how the built environment of placing stairs at the front of the building, of making, if there is an accessible entrance, making it, further to get to, around back, often not actually accessible, right? So the social model allows us to intervene at the level of the built environment, even in kind of social ideas and norms about who is meant to, inhabit a particular space, right? And then for the misfit, it's both of those things, right? We would describe what's happening here as an interaction between body, identity, physical space, cultural norms, the context, right? Is this person, on the way to an important meeting and maybe running a little bit late? How does the temporality of this scene impact this experience, right? So that it sort of locates our conception of disability not in one particular thing, the body or the environment, but rather in this relationship or this meeting of two things. Okay, so with that in mind, oh, yes, I forgot I had another passage here. But what I wanted to emphasize here is this idea that whether or not someone fits or misfits, and I realized I'm just using a version of saying that as if it is only the person, right? Not this interaction. So that's a slip up on my part. But it's not just about fitting or misfitting, but it allows us to also think about and acknowledge the consequences. What are the consequences of fitting? What are the consequences of misfitting? So, in preparation for our discussion today, I asked you to visit a space multiple times throughout the week. And in the description, sort of tying to our focus on the pelvis last week, I suggested a bathroom since it's a place that we all visit multiple times across a week, probably a day. But you could have selected something else, and that's perfectly fine too. But what I want you to do is we're going to send you out into breakout rooms, and I've got some questions for you to discuss with the folks in your room. The first is, just to tell everyone a little bit about the space that you visited, what you observed, and so, the place, but also the time, right? What was it like doing it in a few different iterations? Were there similarities and differences? And then some of these other questions are sort of using this idea of fit or misfit to draw our attention to the interaction, right, between body, other people, the physical space, maybe social norms, that sort of thing. How did you know what to do in that space or how to act? Were there certain cues from the environment or from the folks who are there that help you to understand what the norms or expectations are? And then you're not going to have time to talk about all of these. So pick and choose. You can also chat about, how did you choose to represent that experience, right? Um, the model that I suggested was a kind of written log, but maybe you were thinking in terms of, probably not, hopefully not in a bathroom, maybe photos or recordings or audio or visual representations. What were some of the ways that you attempted to um, distill this and communicate it through your log? Wonderful. Thank you so much. And I love that there's this kind of range of settings that y'all discussed, but so attentive to how yeah, the context can really shape your experience. And I don't know about how where things are at USF or Exeter, but it is very much midterm season here at UNC, and it's palpable. So that's one of those things that my class a couple of weeks ago we were talking about atmospheric non-representational theory, and yeah, that's the sort of thing you can really feel right in the air in a particular context. Excellent. Okay, so I wanted us to kind of be primed to think about again these relationships between body, space, context, um, social norms, etc. Because kind of drawing on or building on Rosemary Garland Thompson's idea of the misfit and a kind of framework that she introduces, the material discursive. I actually brought in a passage from another scholar, Amy Hamrai. We were colleagues, what now feels like a lifetime ago, at Vanderbilt University, and I believe they are now at York University in Canada. But Amy has an excellent book called Building Access that is really exploring, again, how these physical spaces are have so much more meaning than the sort of materiality of them alone. And I think this helps to bridge what we were just talking about between the focus on like the material in the medical model, the body, the social or the discursive in this in the social model, and bringing some of those two things together. So Hamre is really interested in how but how buildings are designed, what effect that has, some of the meanings and assumptions behind that, and then, of course, how it impacts how folks navigate and use those spaces. So they write that built environments are not merely the composite of physical structures, right? So when we use that phrase built environment, yes, there's the physical structure, but there's more to it. Okay, continuing on. So built environments are rather also what Karen Berard calls material discursive phenomena. Berard uses the term material discursive to refer to practices that both produce physical phenomena, such as buildings, and communicate meaning about what kinds of material and social relations should be possible. The material being, again, the physical, the building itself, the discursive, the meaning that gets communicated, right? So, in the context of architecture, for example, inaccessible and segregated environments endorse the participation of and distribution of resources to certain types of bodies in public space, while marginalizing other types of bodies from which access and resources are withheld. Inaccessible environments make the argument that disabled bodies are unworthy of inclusion and quite possibly do not even exist as potential spatial inhabitants. So again, it is this interaction and combination of the material and the discursive that produces this phenomenon that is the misfit, the fit, and all of these consequences that come from that. The distribution of resources, communications of social belonging, um, uh, yeah, of who are the likely, spatial inhabitants. And a classic example that I love to turn to is a building like this one. This is the US Capitol building. So this is where Congress meets on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. And there are elements of the physical design of this building that are, of course, material, but also discursive, right? They communicate meaning about who belongs in this space, what what is meant to happen in the space. So, sort of with that context, sort of knowing what this building is, who is there, what do they do, right? They make laws, Sometimes they pass legislation. Uh, Sometimes they debate legislation, right? To put it diplomatically. So knowing what happens there, what are some of the things that you notice about this building that communicate some meaning? What details stand out to you here? Brings me to a much earlier example of a protest or demonstration on the at the Capitol building. So this is the 1990 Capitol Crawl, which was organized in order to advocate for and the passing and signing of the Americans with Disabilities Act. So that's the kind of landmark civil rights legislation in the US for disabled folks. And the idea here with the Capitol Crawl is that folks who use mobility aids, like wheelchairs, canes, walkers, um, cast them off, right? And then throughout the course of the day, often, quite slowly, sometimes painfully, moved their way up the stairs, right? As this sort of really visual representation of drawing attention to how so much of social and civic life in the United States is inaccessible to many disabled folks and actually operate to exclude disabled folks from full citizenship. So it's a really powerful, I think, symbol, right? That is using the materiality of the space to communicate messages. Yeah, when we have an idea of, again, the likely inhabitant of a space, in this case, a university campus, being someone who is not a wheelchair user, the wheelchair user stands out in some way, maybe becomes hyper visible. And, the wheelchair itself, we might think of as being a kind of material discursive phenomena, right? As both being, this physical thing, this material thing, but it also communicates some meaning or has been imbued with meaning. And it is all about the kind of the interactions there. And I'm just going to quickly overlay the UNC. This is the South Building. This is our sort of seat of at least college-wide power. And I often, when I'm sort of teaching in just a UNC context, we will note some of the similarities in design between those two buildings. So that's just a UNC specific example. Now, I had planned, or I'd thought that we might spend a little bit of time kind of reading, in this instance, images of different spaces. And I want to make sure we have time to look at the poem that I've brought in. So what we're going to do is I have a few images from our different respective campus spaces, and we'll just talk through some of these together rather than move into breakout rooms to do this. But what we'll do is we'll look at some images and similar to what we just did in terms of making observations about the physical space. Um, I'd love to hear from folks about, what are you noticing? Um, who do you imagine to be, or can you infer are the likely inhabitants of the space? Who is likely to fit or misfit in the space? And then what are people meant to do there, right? Um, how do you, how might we discern those expectations from the clues we can glean from the physical space or the image of the physical space and any other messages that seem to be communicated by that space? Okay, so let's pick a couple of examples. Again, I pulled enough for each breakout room. I We've got two buildings here, one from USF, the brand new Honors College building, and then Greenlaw Hall, which is the English department here at UNC. But I actually want to get to one maybe with some people in it. Oh, grr, my images aren't showing up. or they aren't loading. Okay, well, here's a familiar face. This is a classroom at USF. Um, and let's kind of work through some of these questions. What do you notice about the likely inhabitants of the space? Who might fit or misfit? What are people meant to do here? And what other messages do you know, do you think are being communicated between that sort of relationship between the materiality and the discursive? And this can come from USF people who know this space, but it can also come from those of us who've never been there. Excellent. So you're noticing, what that proximity facilitates, right? What that makes possible, but then also what kinds of modes of engaging in that space and relating to other people might not be possible, right? Difficulty maybe navigating around the tables, or I'm thinking someone who's deaf or hard of hearing may be difficult to attend to all the different conversations that are going on. Now, this room, it seems like, is kind of modular. These tables look like maybe they move around. The chairs aren't bolted to the floor. So, at the very least, there's the flexibility, right, to pull a chair out of the way, and someone to roll up and be able to sit at one of the tables. But you're absolutely right. It's context specific, right, in terms of both place and time. What else is happening in that space? Yeah. What are folks meant to do in this kind of? I mean, it's a classroom, so we know there's some kind of learning, or I'm assuming it's a classroom. So we know learning is a piece of it, but what can you glean about the kinds of learning that are expected in this kind of space, or might be normative in this kind of space? So there's intentionality kind of built into the design of that space in order to support certain kinds of activities, learning behaviors, right? And Rosemary Garland Thompson talks about supportive environments, right, that facilitate fit, and then unsupportive environments that produce that kind of misfit. And I want us to be kind of thinking about, what makes an environment supportive. What are some of the things that makes an environment unsupportive? And that is, again, it's context specific. It depends on the person in a lot of ways. Um, I could have included a picture from the Hive Lab, which is our health humanities lab, where this class also meets in person. We've been we don't have a brand new space with some of this, flexible design, but we've been trying to adapt what we have to make it a more supportive environment. But sometimes a supportive environment for one person, that facilitates fit, the same supportive environment may produce misfit in a different context relationship between body, time, place, right? So even if, as folks talk about universal design, attempting to create built environments that are as supportive as possible to the broadest set of bodies, needs, activities, there will be limits to what's possible there. Okay, so I want to. Oh, I forgot about this piece, but it's okay. It's going to segue briefly to that, or I'll segue quickly to that poem that I'd like for us to take a look at. Because the Tanya Tucholsky chapter that I assigned, I think demonstrates in many ways how to fit an environment or fit with an environment is a kind of, I think Garland Thompson describes it as like an anonymizing process, but certain aspects of this relationship between body and environment often aren't illuminated until there's a misfit. So Tanya Tucholsky is writing about one specific space. Her academic building at, oops, I forget what university, somewhere in Canada. I want to say Toronto, but don't quote me on that. That has no accessible washroom, right, or restroom. So even though there are signs on, I think, one of the restrooms that say like that sort of universal symbol of access, it is not actually accessible. And she's puzzling through, why is that the case, right? How did that come to be? And in asking that question, right, she receives a number of stories, as she calls them, ordinary stories that serve as a kind of everyday justification for the exclusion of disabled folks from that space, right? So she's really thinking about there's the material environment, but also the messaging around it, the meaning that it takes on and what that communicates. So one of those stories is this one. Some faculty and staff say they fought hard some 20 years ago just to get a ramp for the front door of the building. They suggest that that is probably when the signs of universal access were posted everywhere, including an inaccessible washroom, uh, including on, excuse me, inaccessible washroom doors. Once posted, how are we to know any better, right? And the point being about these ordinary stories is not that everyone who says something like this in response to, well, why is the sign there? And well, when the washroom isn't accessible, it's not to say they're horrible people or that there was some nefarious plot to produce this misfit, right? But rather there's an ordinariness to it that accumulate to something quite extraordinary, this kind of exclusion and exclusion that seems justified or justifiable. But I wanted to dwell on this, how were we to know any better question, because it, I think, speaks to, again, the sort of material discursive, the embodied knowledge and the more sort of conceptual or discursive knowledge, right? Because that symbol of universal access, usually a blue background with the sort of icon of a wheelchair user, signals something, right? It communicates quite literally, or maybe not literally, excuse me, but it is a powerful symbol that this is an accessible space. So that symbol was sort of took precedent over folks' embodied experience of the space, right? How does that happen? How does this symbol, come to be sort of prioritized in our thinking over our actual experience? So part of Tchaikovsky's explanation is that the sensorium is so well diseducated. And by that, she really means that, again, we've sort of been trained in many ways to ignore the body and the ways that we move through space and to prioritize the symbolic, the discursive, the meaning over what we know in and through our bodies, right? And this is a longer passage here that I won't get into, but she concludes some people's own bodily activity of squeezing through the accessible doorway is not perceived, but it's not because the building contains a mob of aberrantly prejudicial people. Something has organized the possibility of not perceiving the contradiction between the access sign and the lived experience of using the doors. So our focus together on our embodied experiences of knowing through the body can work to, let's say, re-educate our sensorium to be attentive to these kind of contradictory moments. Okay, I've once again not given us enough time to do everything that I want to do. And I'm really bummed about that because I love this poem that I wanted to share with you. We'll briefly take a look at it. But we won't have time to break out and to talk through it. But what I'd like for you to do as we're reading, I'll read through it, and I want you to just make note of anything that comes to mind as you're reading it. But I especially want you to think about, sorry, I'm going to put the notes or the questions in the chat. Do, 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 do. Um, how or what does this poem communicate or represent between the material, the discursive, or the material discursive aspect of inaccessibility? Um, what are the sustaining environments or unsustaining environments that show up? And perhaps in what ways is the poem itself both material and discursive? So things to think about. I'll read it and then I'll hand things over to Tina to talk a little bit about our bridging activity. Okay. So this poem is Body Encounters Barrier or Stairs, Not a Metaphor by Tara Hardy. In the current secretly intentional house, there is cope with condition itself, cannot be underestimated. There is barrier. There is encountering barrier. There is struggle to negotiate barrier while being watched. There is kindly meant offer to help, almost always appreciated. There is kindly meant, but no asking first, help, that often involves non consensual touch. There is the hyper visibility of body and invisibility of personhood, a neat paradox conjured by inaccessibility. There is, don't observably feel anything about any piece which equals choke down, snake of shame, muscle grown in the jungle of unintentionality. There is, during all, cheerfully, patiently, with its apparently unfruitfully educate while performing disability in public. Go 10 clicks, repeat. But when the roof, walls, windows, when the floor, floorboards, foundation, when the cup of land that holds house is love, is welcome, when the nakedly intentional shelter is access for body, disability, and or Black, brown, trans, non-binary, queer, Muslim, fat, elder, child, carbon-based and breathing, valued simply for being, and never demanded for government document. There is no barrier, no encounter of it, no being watched, only aid, consent, no shame, never blame. Visibility, right-sized, equals neighbor, not snake. Repeat of this life is clean, skate on frozen lake. Imagine the beloved who needs assistance vacuuming saliva from her mouth, always has a willing hand, holding hose. Backup heart, whose intention is set on weatherproof interdependence. This is the house, the land, the world of access, of welcome, of here. You belong here. So why I really wanted us to, unfortunately, we don't have the time to talk through it too terribly much here, but to think with this poem is because how it attends to the material, it attends to the discursive, and it imagines a different kind of organization, right? A different relation, a relationality between body and space, a different kind of space, a different kind of way of relating to other people or to the built environment. We just have time for one or two observations or comments from folks. But what stood out to you while reading this about any of these ideas we've been talking about? Fit, misfit, supportive, unsupportive environments, etc. I wanted to give Tina a moment to share a little bit about our bridging activity for next time, which is to design a memorial wreath substrate that represents yourself or someone you love. And we've got instructions on the handbook, but Tina, if you would just give us a little bit of context, that would be helpful.
Absolutely. And thank you, Kim, for sharing that poem. That was lovely. So next week, as we transition from built environments and embodiment, we'll be looking at how we can use our bodies to create healthy environments. And so,
Mhm.
whether your muse for this selected activity is yourself, looking at a translational self portrait of sorts, or if this is something that you would like to use a muse of a loved one, whether it's a mother or a brother or a grandparent or friend, using their identity or your identity to explore different concepts, whether these be objectional representations of this individual or capturing more of an abstract essence. We'll be exploring what kind of drawing or sketch you could come up with for this individual, as we'll be doing an activity looking at what kind of memorialization portrait could you make for this individual? And we'll talk more about built environments within marine habitats and how these can be applied, and discuss more about how these embodied practices can be implemented within some of these memorial reef concepts. So please do upload your drawings and sketches. It's not about, being a skilled drawer. It's just about visually communicating those ideas. So feel free to put labels in and other things that might help visually communicate those ideas. So that way, when we get into our breakouts, we'll have something to discuss.